Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Brendan Cole. Now, with several airports and Heathrow its biggest, you might think London is connected enough to the rest of the world. Well, not so, say many business leaders, politicians and trade unions who believe Heathrow is buckling under the pressure of operating at 98% capacity. They say London can't compete with other European hubs such as Amsterdam, Paris and Frankfurt, all racing to overtake Heathrow as the continent's premier airport. Indeed, a report out last week said the UK could lose up to £100 billion over 20 years if it didn't build a third runway at Heathrow. But another option is on the table, that is to build a second hub in the Thames estuary. But this could cost up to £50 billion and may take up to 25 years to develop. When expansion at Heathrow was cancelled 2 years ago by the coalition government, environmental campaigners might have just thought they had won the argument. But the issue of Heathrow expansion is very much back on the table. Well, joining me to discuss this issue is Janson. He's the Policy Director of Tourism Alliance. We have John Stewart from the Anti-Heathrow Expansion Group HACAN, Robert Oxley, who's the Campaign Manager for the Taxpayers Alliance. And on the line, we have Andrew Lambourne from the group Hertfordshire Against Luton Expansion, or HALE. And I'm just going to ask a very quick and simple question, starting with you, Kurt. Heathrow expansion, is it a good idea or a bad idea?
It's a very good idea, and it's a very good idea for the UK economy as a whole. The UK tourism industry is the sixth largest in the world. It's actually our sixth major tourism export, is people coming into the country and spending their money creating jobs here. If we do not have expansion, then we do not have a viable tourism industry going into the future.
John Stewart, expansion is necessary in London, isn't it?
No, we don't think it is. We think it's bad for environmental reasons, but we don't think it's necessary for economic reasons. Heathrow expansion would be bad for environmental reasons, but we also think there's no economic case for expansion. Although the runways are close to capacity, the terminals can take 20 million extra passengers each year. We believe the way forward is to reduce the number of short-haul flights using Heathrow, 20-25% of planes, and that would free up capacity to bring in extra planes from the fast-developing economies of China, India and places like Brazil.
Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance, he has a point, doesn't he, that existing capacity at Heathrow could be expanded through other means other than a third runway.
Well, I think the point is that we have Heathrow operating at 95% on the runway, so we do need a third runway to bring that hub idea to Heathrow. I don't think it's right to say that environmental campaigners did win the argument against Heathrow. What happened is that the nature of coalition politics with the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats both needing those vital West London votes, they felt that they couldn't press ahead with it. And what we are seeing today is we are seeing the tourism industry, we're seeing business, and we're seeing the economy, which is flatlining at the moment, needing this third runway to get business moving, because otherwise business is going to look to invest in other countries which have got increased capacity and who are looking to invest in their airport capacity.
Andrew Lambourne from HALE, where you're campaigning against expansion of Luton Airport. Which is the strongest argument in your view? Is it environmental or is it a degree of NIMBYism?
I think you have to look at this whole issue from a number of different points of view, and you have to look very strategically, because obviously airports are massive infrastructure investments, and equally airports have massive impact, not just in terms of tourism, not just in terms of local ecology, but impact on climate change, obviously, and obviously also one has to consider the actual commercial benefits of what we're trying to do. It doesn't necessarily follow that having more airports or more runway capacity will lead to extra business being done. What you need for extra business to be done is goods and services that other people want to buy from you. As far as tourism is concerned, yes, of course, it's a good thing to have tourists inbound to the UK, but flight capacity means also that tourists are outbound from the UK spending money overseas, and the balance of payments in terms of tourism is currently negative. So I think there are some very big strategic issues, and I think the biggest mistake in any debate about airports is to think too much in the short term and to not think strategically.
Janson, from a tourism perspective, what kind of impact does Britain facing in the next 10 to 15 years if there isn't an increase in airport capacity?
Well, let's look at the figures. The World Tourism Organization has predicted that global tourism will rise by 60% by 2020. Okay. Now, 50% of that increase will come from just 4 countries. That's Brazil, India, China, and Russia. Now, those are long-haul destinations. To service long-haul destinations, you need a hub airport. You can't just have point-to-point airports. So we need a hub airport. We need a viable hub airport. To give you an example of just how bad the situation's become, despite all our cultural, historic, sporting, friends and relatives, all the links we have with India, 50% more Indians go on holiday in France than the UK. There is just not the capacity. We can't get the flights to get the visitors into the country. And these visitors spend over £1,000 each per person. So times it up by 500 people on a 747. That's over £500,000 per plane that you're foregoing into the UK economy. And that's simply because we do not have the capacity at the moment. And that £500,000 per plane for the economy is 10 full-time jobs for the UK economy for a year from one plane. And that's what we're foregoing at the moment. So we definitely do need the capacity. I don't stand for the British airport operators. I don't kind of side with the British Airlines. I'm here to represent the tourism businesses in the UK, 80% of which are small kind of family-run businesses which depend on overseas visitors coming into the country. Now, those overseas visitors at the moment create 400,000 jobs for these family-run businesses. Now, we produced 5% growth last year in inbound tourism. Okay, 5% growth in an economy that's stalling and not going anywhere is incredibly significant. It created just under 20,000 new jobs for the UK economy. We're a growth industry, we do our job incredibly well, but we have these infrastructure kind of constraints which stop us from competing on the world stage in the way that we should be.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. John Stewart, I'll turn to you. It's stopping Britain competing on the world stage. It's a disincentive for people to come here. This needs to be considered, doesn't it?
We certainly are supporters of more tourists coming to this country. I think it needs to be said, though, at the moment, as far as business generally is concerned, London is the best connected city in the world. The global survey done by Cushman and Wakefield showed it's the top city for business. Now, the problem is not so much now. That's the starting point. The starting point, I've got to say, BAA often ignore in their reports. But there is a real question raised by Kurt and others. What's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years? That's what we need to be talking about. Now, we do believe we need to get more business and more tourists in from China, from India, from Russia. But we believe that the way is to rejig the existing capacity at airports so that the short-haul flights to domestic destinations near Europe, not all of them, but there's a significant modal shift we would like to see to fast, affordable rail services. And that would free up the space for more long-distance passengers, be they business people or tourists, to come from the Far East and elsewhere without having to go for this sort of capacity building that we're talking about, and certainly without having to go for a third runway at Heathrow.
Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance. The UK is one of the most well-connected places in Europe and extremely well-placed for business and for tourism. There's no need for this, is there?
Well, not at all. I think what we've got to do is explain this hub argument. The idea is that when an airline flies into an airport, when you're a passenger flying into an airport, you might want to make a connection. You don't want to make that connection if you're having to travel halfway across London to then go and do a short-haul flight, say, to another part of Europe. Having that kind of capacity all centred in one location encourages businesses to invest. It encourages airlines to open up routes. And I've heard some hilarious statistics about the fact that it's actually quite difficult now to fly directly from London to Mexico because of the way that capacity is limited. And capacity is limited. Anyone who has flown into Heathrow recently and say spent an hour circling the skies, not particularly green, will understand that there is an issue about the amount of flights that are landing in Heathrow. And I can understand why residents will be will have concerns about those environmental impacts. I live under the route into Heathrow as well, so I know exactly what it's like. But at the same time, this is something that we have a general lack of air capacity in South East England, and specifically that if we are going to invest in air capacity, the logical and most cost-affordable way to do that is into Heathrow, because there are people putting forward other alternatives, but they wouldn't be practical considering the huge cost it would be to set up another hub in another part of the UK.
Andrew Lambourne from HALE, where you are, there's a lot of opposition to increasing capacity at Luton Airport, which is a much smaller airport north of London, of course, in Hertfordshire. What are the main concerns among residents there?
Well, it's interesting, actually, because Luton and Heathrow share the fact that both of them started as reasonably small municipal airports in the sort of 1930s, and both of them have grown significantly. Heathrow, obviously, far more so. I think the problem with Luton, in particular, is it's poorly sited. It's on top of a hill for a start, so you can't get direct rail services to it. Therefore, most passengers actually travel by car or by taxi into the airport. Secondly, it's surrounded by quite large urban conurbations. It is, in fact, just on the south side of Luton itself. And so obviously over the years, as planes have got larger and noisier, there's been a creeping impact as flights have increased from sort of a couple of million when the cheap holidays packages started up to nowadays around about 9.5 million and going up. That, you know, the folk living around the airport are being increasingly impacted by something which wasn't so much of a problem when perhaps they first moved to the area. And I think this is an example of where planning needs to be sensible and needs to be joined up. Just because there is an airport in a particular location doesn't necessarily mean that that airport should be further expanded, because the cost to the local environment will be far more significant than if, for example, the airport was located in a place where there was more space available, where there were clear and easy transport routes to wherever people wanted to go to.
Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance. You can't expand indefinitely, and surely any kind of expansion might serve its purpose for 15, 20 years, but then you'd have to look at further expansion, and there is a pledge to reduce CO2 emissions, I think, by 80% by 2050. You can't have both, can you?
Well, the point is China at the moment is in the process of building hundreds of new airports. So the idea that we're going to, by stopping one airport in London, when we are already at crunch capacity today at that airport, is going to have an effect into the global effect of climate change and emissions. So yes, there is a green argument to be had, and we need to have greener planes. We need to reduce those emissions. But the idea that stopping one runway at an airport which is already under the strain of capacity is the answer to that. Is basically it's tying Britain down and holding them back in a very competitive market.
Kurt Janson from Tourism Alliance. On the one hand, you have a plan that was shelved by the coalition government. There's no immediate plans to look at this issue until after 2015, and certainly for the terms of this Parliament. There's no political will for this. So it's a difficult argument to win. And what can your group do to promote the interests of tourism, and with that in mind?
I don't think it is a difficult argument to win. I mean, the argument is basically, do we want jobs and do we want growth for the economy? And if we want that, and we want the country to grow, get back on its feet again, then we need to improve our infrastructure for tourism, for business. Now, that's not forsaking environmental concerns. These can be dealt with. Just set levels for noise pollution and for emissions, and let the industry work within those bounds. The industry is incredibly inventive. It can come up with answers. It's investing huge amounts of money in technology. It can solve those problems. Just give it the capacity or give it the room to be able to come up with creative solutions to this. If we don't have additional capacity, it is not going to stop people flying in the world. It's only going to stop people flying here. It's not going to have any impact on emissions at all, and it's going to mean that we don't get any growth or any jobs.
John Stewart from HACAN, you have a situation actually where the airport at Amsterdam has 18 connections to the UK. From Heathrow, there's only 6. You could argue that Amsterdam is becoming the main hub into the United Kingdom. That's quite costly, isn't it, for the UK?
I think we've got to compare like with like, because we need to compare all the runways using London, all the runways and airports at Amsterdam, Paris, Frankfurt, and so on. And when you do that, London has more runways and is used by more people than any other city in Europe. We are in the lead. So this concentration on Heathrow, I think, is a mistake, because most people who want to come to London for business or tourists don't actually mind which airport they arrive at. So I don't really accept the fact that Europe is going to be in the lead. It's not in the lead at the moment. And as we look at this enormous protest going on at Frankfurt against the fourth runway that's been built there are protests in other European cities. I just think certainly in Western Europe it's going to be very, very difficult to expand airports without the sort of protests that we're seeing in Frankfurt and that we saw against the third runway at Heathrow. And realistically, I think UK PLC has got to think of ways of working within those boundaries.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're talking about the expansion of Heathrow Airport in London. Joining me is Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance, Kurt Janson, Policy Director of Tourism Alliance, John Stewart of HACAN, the anti-Heathrow expansion group, and Andrew Lambourne from Hertfordshire against Luton Expansion. I'm going to turn back to you, Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance. The government has made a pledge for a high-speed railway, for instance, which may take a generation to build. But these are the kinds of areas that need to be looked at instead, don't they?
Well, I think, we have been very ardent in our opposition about HS2, the high-speed railway that they are proposing to link Birmingham and London. Now, what they are doing is they are spending £32 billion at their own conservative estimates on a line which the Treasury is now actually realising their very poor estimates of how much money it would, how productive it would be, are actually way off. And they're investing to link to the fastest line that already exists in this country, somehow arguing that is going to help international passengers. And I do want to come back to the point that, saying that you could land in either of London airports. Anyone who has, say, landed in Heathrow, the thought of trying to get to Stansted under the current capacity and having to go through all the immigration checks, then make your way across central London, stay at rush hour to fly out somewhere else, that is just simply not practical. And high-speed rail, we're talking about a country which is quite tiny compared to our European neighbours. We don't need a high-speed rail system to link those two, and it certainly isn't the answer to the air capacity issues that we are faced with in the southeast. And statistics have shown that the government investment that they are putting forward, it is a huge underestimation of the cost, and they're hugely overestimating the benefits that it will bring to UK. Moving on to
the possibility, the proposal of another hub. What about the idea of a split hub in the Thames estuary, the so-called Boris Island? This would be a good compromise, Kurt Janson from Tourism Alliance.
If it was decided to go straight to a hub in Boris Island, we're talking up to 50 years. We do not have 50 years to solve our air capacity issue. We need to solve it now. We are losing out in the main growth markets for tourism. In 50 years' time, we will not be the leading destination. We will not have the biggest kind of hub airport in Europe. Those days will go on. We will be looking back and going, why didn't we make that decision that we needed at the time it was needed?
John Stewart, I know that your group campaigns specifically against Heathrow expansion, but what is your group's view on the Thames estuary issue as a proposal, as an alternative to a third runway at Heathrow?
We don't think much more hub capacity is required. We think this is a misnomer. The seminal report that was conducted by CE Delft in 2008 showed that London and London's economy is less dependent on hub capacity, is less dependent on passengers transferring from one plane to another than any other major place in Europe. And this is because London is such an important place as a destination to business people and to tourists that they are going to come here anyway, regardless of whether a Heathrow or anywhere else expands as a hub. Clearly, as Robert has said, Heathrow is important as a hub, but what this report showed quite clearly that it doesn't need to expand its hub capacity in order to remain important to business and tourists, because they're coming here anyway, and therefore we would argue that we don't really need to see extra hub capacity at Heathrow or on the Thames estuary.
And what would your view on that be?
Well, I would say that you need to look at the list of people who are coming out and saying that they do need expansion at the third runway. The previous government were proposing that, and obviously I think the political map that we have today is a large reason why we don't have a third runway going ahead at the moment. But then also, you can see at the moment that we're hearing stories that within the Treasury and within Number 10 that they are starting to realise that economically they need to go forward with this. But we also have people like the CBI, the Institute of Directors, even the TUC, the trade unions. They are in favour of this idea of expanding Heathrow with a third runway and getting Britain open for business, because we have a capacity issue today, and we aren't going to solve it by going off with Boris's Island, in 50 years' time. And the point is, Boris's Island might work if the Thames airport might work in a sense of if it had private investment, but taxpayers' money for the real investment that we need to make at the moment, we can't wait 50 years. We need to get that investment into Heathrow today. But
John Stewart has a point, doesn't he, in that Heathrow is actually inefficient. I'll cite an example. Air Malta flies twice a day from Heathrow to Valletta. It has retained its slots due to an agreement that was struck many, many years ago. It's taking up space that a plane from Sao Paulo could fly from. So it's not being used in the most efficient way. This should be the priority, shouldn't it? Well, surely we can tinker with the slots that we have, and the fact but we won't escape the fact that at the moment the two airports are at the two runways are at about 95% capacity, whereas our European neighbours are about 30, like our major European hubs are about 30 to 40% less than that. So yes, there is tinkering to do, but ultimately we'll be rationing a resource. We won't be bringing more business into Britain. We won't be creating those extra routes, which is what we really need to get the UK economy going. This is a problem today, and it's not something that we can put off for the next 30 or 40 years. What about the idea of mixed mode operation, where both runways can be used both for takeoff and landing? I mean, that's realistically in the short term is something that could potentially increase capacity. What would your group make of that? Well, I think short term, there will be decisions that have to be made, and that might be one of those practical solutions. But ultimately, you are only delaying the inevitable, which is discussions about what the actual capacity should be. How many flights can we actually get into that airport, which now has 5 terminals, 5 world-class terminals? I think it's right that we have a system where we are bringing in business to the UK, and we are saying that Britain is open to business, and especially when you look at what's going on across the Channel, and you can see that the Eurozone is going through its absolute crisis at the moment. It's right that we send out a very clear message that Britain is the location where we want business to invest in. What about you, John Stewart? What do you make of the mixed mode operation idea, and would that be a compromise you'd be happy with?
No, I don't think it would be, because right now people get a half day's break from the noise. Mixed mode would mean a plane going over people, one every 90 seconds right throughout the day. And we must remember that according to the European Union, 725,000 people are disturbed by the Heathrow flight path. That is 28% of all people disturbed by aircraft noise right across Europe. It seems to me that's the starting point. And to make that matter even worse, we think is not an option. And therefore, other options need to be looked at if we are going to help business and tourism in the UK.
Andrew Lambourne from Hertfordshire against Luton Expansion. You have to balance the needs, I suppose, of residents living in your area, but at the same time, you're actually hindering the argument in terms of environmental and business questions, aren't you?
Well, why don't we start by just clarifying what we mean by business? We're having a discussion ostensibly about whether there's a benefit to Britain of bringing in more tourists and providing capacity for tourism, but mixed in with that, there's also a discussion about whether this helps business in general. If I'm right, in 2011, 40% of inbound flights to the UK were for purposes of holidays, 20% were business-related, and the other 40% were social visits. And as we've said already, there's a balance of payments deficit. For the people that come into Britain to spend their money as tourists, more people fly out of Britain and spend more money as tourists overseas. And that deficit was £20 billion in 2008-9. And that has fallen to £13 billion by 2011. Why has it fallen? Because of a reduction in people making flights overseas. You have to be very careful in what you're talking about and what you mean by business. If you're a hub, if you're an airport, a huge hub, where people fly long haul and then change planes to short haul, does that actually help the location where the hub is in terms of incoming investment and spend? No, it doesn't. People are just changing planes.
Kurt Janson from Tourism Alliance. It's difficult to have a debate about airport expansion. Do you think that's something that will change? And, for instance, if we take the example of Frankfurt Airport, where environmental lobby was consulted and there was a compromise made, they agreed to spend several £100 million on a reforestation program. Environmental groups aren't really having that conversation with business leaders, with trade unions.
Yes, it's one of the interesting things. I think some of it comes from the kind of the planning system here, which you have a planning system which says it puts constraints on what you're able to do and how many flights and kind of what when you can operate, all that type of thing. If we move to a system which was output based, so that's a system which says this is what is unacceptable in the way of noise, this is what is unacceptable in the way of pollution. Now you, the industry, work around that. Come up with an innovative means of keeping noise levels and pollution levels down below the kind of the outputs that we're after, and then you can go ahead. And that's the debate we should be having. Let's, everyone's kind of grown up about this. Let's have limits on noise, limits on pollution. Let the industry sort out those problems and be able to expand, rather than just say, no, expansion's just not on the table.
That debate needs to be had, doesn't it, John Stewart from HACAN? And it's not being had, is it?
Yes, that debate needs to be had. I think it's beginning to happen, actually, because I would agree with a lot of what Curtis just said there. And to some extent, I think that this government is actually saying that its new policy will be framed within climate change and quality of life, by which it means noise targets. Now, it depends how tough those targets are. But essentially, I think that's where the debate starts. And if we can get those targets in place, Kurt's absolutely right, then there's a challenge. I think it probably needs to be a significant challenge and a real challenge, but then there's a challenge for the industry to meet those targets, and only if it meets those targets can it look to expand. I think the debate is beginning to happen, but it's going to take quite some years for it to become a fruitful dialogue.
And just finally, Robert Oxley from the Taxpayers Alliance, what are the plans for your group to push forward the interests of Heathrow expansion, because it seems to be a debate that you're losing, isn't it?
Well, I think there's two sides of the opposition. There are those who simply don't agree with flying, low-cost flying, and they don't want any more flights. And then there are those groups who are residents who are unhappy about the location. And I think that as efforts are made to mitigate the impact on local residents, and whether the government does engage on that, the opposition to expansion will significantly decrease, because those people who are opposed to all flights in general, are finding themselves very much on the wrong side of the growth agenda, when growth is absolutely key to this country at the moment, when the economy isn't in a great state. So I think it will take engagement with residents who are affected by the flights. As I said, I am one of those people who is under the flight path, but probably not to an extent where it's not something that keeps me up at night. But you can't pretend that there aren't people who are affected quite deeply by the effect of noise pollution from flights coming in. I think if those people are helped and their issues are addressed, the general opposition to airport expansion will melt away, because it will be found to only be those people who are simply opposed to all flights in general, and I don't think that's an argument that can be won.
I'd like to end now by thanking all my guests for joining me. Brendan Cole on The Voice of Russia. Stay tuned for the headlines.